Hello and welcome to the third and final installment for session 22 on fermented foods. This one is a little bit longer. We're going to go through a couple of specific examples of fermented foods for you, and I'll give you some of my tips and tricks for making them relatively successful when you hopefully go off and try to create these for yourselves. Okay, so to begin with fermented foods, there are two main types of starter cultures, and this is a reason for wild fermentation versus specific microorganism fermentation, and the reason why things are referred to as such. So the first is wild fermentation, which basically is a fermentation that utilizes the surrounding environment. So the bacteria and yeast that are specific to where you are in the world at that particular time. And wild fermentation is collecting these bacteria and yeast in a very specific way, and then you use that as the starter culture for your fermentation products. The second is the application of a specific microorganism, and this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, the adding of a specific microorganism may ferment the food in a very particular way to give you a product, an end product that you are looking for. And secondly, there may be research, for example, on a particular microorganism and its effects on a particular health condition, and you're wanting to mimic that in a clinical setting, and so you're wanting to use a starting culture that contains that particular strain. So two different ideas. Like I said, in your microbiota, it will change depending on lots of different things, but it will also change depending on the area that you move to, and this may be an evolutionary advantage. The area that you move to, your microbiota changes in response to that to give you the best immunization, if you like, for that area. So two very different views on fermentation, wild fermentation versus specific organisms. Both have advantages, and it's just something to have a think about and have a read about when considering the health of the organism and the health of therefore the health of the patient in front of you. So the first fermented food that we're going to do is cabbage, and probably the most well-known dishes with the use of cabbage are sauerkraut and kimchi, both from different areas of the world, but both use cabbage, fermented cabbage, as the main component there. The bonus of using cabbage, if you hopefully remember back to your cruciferous vegetables, or herbs for that matter, you will know that they have specific nutrients, phytonutrients within them that are really effective against certain cancers, for example. We'll go through that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But fermenting a cruciferous vegetable can help to pre-digest and therefore help with absorbability of those phytonutrients, but also they can help with breaking down any of the not so beneficial aspects of cabbage. And also it changes the flavor, which is a real win for some people. Okay, here's a picture of sauerkraut. If you haven't tried it or seen it, you can see the shredded cabbage there. And you can see that it's a distinct change in color. This would have been a white cabbage, obviously, to begin with. But with sauerkraut, traditionally you use white cabbage, but really, if you're making sauerkraut, sometimes it's beautiful to add in a bit of purple cabbage, for example. So sauerkraut is simply shredded cabbage and salt. That's really all that you need, so it's nice and simplistic to make. And therefore it's a great one to start with when you're starting to play with these sorts of fermented products. The pH is usually around 3.5 to 3.8. So again, we're setting up an environment where pathogenic microorganisms are, well, an environment that's hostile to them. And at the end, sauerkraut products, depending on where they're made and how they're made, contain beneficial bacteria. So here's just a list of some of the beneficial bacteria that sauerkraut has been known to contain. So to make it, you basically need a large sterilized jar or pot. Those mad keen sauerkrauters will probably have a beautiful ceramic pot, and that just helps to maintain a stable environment a little bit easier than a glass jar. You generally need a plate or stone, something that's heavy and of course sterile. Start with one cabbage just while you're playing around with it, but when you get used to it and you start consuming a lot of it, or you start giving it away as presents to people, you can make as much as you want in one batch. So one cabbage to about 3 tablespoons of sea salt, and that's a rough guide. You'll get better at tasting things and thinking, oh, do I need a bit more or not? I did mention in the last session that I would point out some references that are really useful. So this guy, Bill Mollison, he has kind of a Bible of fermentation. It's called the Permaculture Book of Ferment and Human Nutrition. It's in your reference list at the end of this slide, this presentation. It's a very thick book and it's very intense, so you've really got to want to love fermentation to get into it, but it gives such practical advice that a lot of people have kind of used it and springboarded off it to start with fermentation. So you start off by washing the cabbage really well, pulling off the older leaves. Don't throw them away. They actually contain a lot of beneficial bacteria, so you're wanting to use them to line the pot and place on top of the final product as a way of sort of like a wild fermentation. This contains the bacteria that you're actually wanting to use. Quarter the cabbage, remove the stalk, and shred the leaves. The finer you shred the leaves, the better. Then you're going to layer the cabbage, so put down a little bit of cabbage, shredded cabbage, and then a bit of salt, a bit of cabbage, a bit of salt, a bit of cabbage, a bit of salt. And then comes the fun bit. You are basically going to squish and grab and smash the cabbage, and what you're doing there is starting to break down the cell walls within the cabbage that releases the water that's held in the cabbage. And this is a time really, to get rid of all that frustrated stuff, liver chi, get at your frustration and stamp it all down. Once that's completed, you'll know it's completed because the shredded cabbage is covered by the juice from the cabbage, and you're really wanting to make sure that it's well covered. Then use something heavy like the plate or the stone to weigh down the cabbage, the shredded cabbage underneath the juice. Now the reason for this is anything that's left protruding at the top of the juice creates a really delightful environment for non-beneficial bacteria, yeast and fungus particularly. So just make sure that everything's covered, all material is covered. And make sure that the top of the jar is clean. A lot of people forget this point, and that becomes a nice microbial growth center, and it'll quickly turn your sauerkraut off. Then close the airtight lid and place in a warm space for about 2 weeks. Now, with any fermentation, I'm always going to say check it every couple of days. And this is because it may leak, mold may grow, it may start to smell, it may start to change color. That is kind of not the color that you're changing color that you're looking for. The cabbage may become unsubmerged. So there's lots of things that you need to watch out for, just in the first couple of days particularly. You can open the lid and check the smell of it. every couple of days if you really want. Keeping in mind we're trying to create an anaerobic environment, so try and reduce the amount of times that you do that. Do that if you're a bit concerned and really start to get used to the smell changes that happen with sauerkraut. You can try salt-free options of sauerkraut as well, so fermenting in wine, for example, and using herbs such as caraway, celery or dill. You can also try seaweed instead of salt to try and reduce the pathogenic bacteria. I've given you a reference at the end of Sandor Katz's K-A-T-Z wild fermentation. He kind of took a lot of Mollison's ideas and made them a bit more user-friendly, a bit more easy to understand. And so his book, or his books, but his book Wild Fermentation particularly, has some good recipes for alternates to sauerkraut that may be really useful, particularly if you're wanting to avoid salt. And you can also consider adding lots of different things to your sauerkraut for flavour. This is the traditional way of doing it, but things like cumin seeds, apple, buttermilk, sliced radish, coriander, mustard seeds, chili, garlic, ginger, chives. These are all things that you can add to sauerkraut to drastically change the flavour. And some people absolutely love it. Because sauerkraut is from cabbage, you're going to have a very similar nutritional and phytochemical profile to cabbage. Excuse me. However, there's some changes that occur. Basically, with fermentation, you're pre-digesting the cabbage. So your glucosinolates are going to convert into a much more usable and digestible form of indole 3-carbinol, for example, or isothiocinates. And these are more bioaccessible, and they're also very strong anti-cancer nutrients. So we use them in clinic, or we suggest food as medicine in clinic to have an anti-carcinogenic effect. So they've been shown, and same with the next point, the next flavonoid has been shown to reduce cancer but also chronic diseases. So it does things like inhibit cancer growth. It improves apoptosis of the cell, so cell death when necessary, but it seems to preserve normal cells, which is quite a wonderful aspect of using food as medicine. Fermentation in general will usually decrease vitamins that like vitamin C. So it's just something to be aware of. Sauerkraut in itself is not a meal. Fermented foods accompany meals. So just be aware that you are going to have reduced vitamin C if you're relying solely on cabbage for vitamin C, that you will have to add additional foods to your diet, which hopefully you or your patients are already doing. The next is kimchi, which is Korean food. Using cabbage, but using wonbok, which personally is my favorite cabbage, and then using other ingredients like garlic, ginger, shallots, red pepper. It really depends on which part of Korea you are from as to what types of ingredients you will throw in there. The next point is pretty apt. There's about 187 kinds of kimchi, and that depends on ingredients and also processing methods. And kimchi is a very popular accompaniment to meals in Korea, and quite a delicious accompaniment to meals. It's generally low kilojoule, a good source of vitamins, minerals and fiber. It has very similar phytochemicals to sauerkraut, and again, it's pre-digested, so more absorbable phytochemicals. And of course, it has beneficial bacteria, which can influence the microbiome. In vitro animal studies and some preliminary human studies, it's a bit more difficult to do human studies, but there are a few. We can see anti-cancer, which has a lot to do with the phytonutrients already found in cruciferous vegetables, anti-obesity, anti-constipation, etc. So you can see that these foods are not only affecting, let's say, the nutrients that are within the food that they're predigesting, and also the microbiome and the immune system, but they have wide-ranging effects, which is exciting. Fermented milk products is next. So their major categories are lactoferments, yeast lactic ferments, and mold lactic ferments. And I've given you a couple of examples of typical foods that fall within those categories. Kefir is probably one of the more popular. It's becoming more popular. You see it a lot in health food shops these days. People are becoming a bit more aware of it. It's a fermented milk product that originated in Russia. It's known sometimes as champagne of milk. I don't think it tastes like champagne or milk, but I can see why it gets that name. You can have water kefir and milk kefir. We're referring to the milk kefir here, dairy kefir. It is very bubbly and fizzy, and it's one of those products that you make and then it fizzes all over your bag as you're carrying it around. That's happened to me quite a few times. So it's made by adding specific bacteria and yeast. They're commonly known as kefir grains, and they look like little granules. That they're just like symbiotic communities of bacteria and yeast, sometimes called scobies. Now in this form, in the Russian form, the milk is heated, so allowing it to curd, but you don't have to heat milk kefir. The end taste is strong, tangy and sour, and it depends on how long you ferment for. It's basically feeding on the lactose within milk, so the less milk sugar you've got in there, the more sour it's going to become. And it is slightly alcoholic, so it's something to remember for people who are intolerant or refuse to have alcohol in their diets. So we're going to talk about water kefir later, but here is how to make, well, one way of making milk kefir is you start with a SCOBY, so it's a very specific combination. A symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast is what SCOBY stands for. One is dairy and one is water. They look totally different. So this is the dairy kefir. It kind of looks a bit like cauliflower, and this grows over time. So for anyone that you know, maybe you want to get on the blog and ask if anyone has any kefir grains. Once you start making this, it grows and grows and grows, and you can just give it away to people. It's like a naturopath's dream, really, isn't it? A nutritionist's dream. So you start with the kefir grains, and then you just feed it what it wants, which is milk. And you can, some people like to use particular types of milk, so some people suggest non-pasteurized and non-fermented milk works a little bit better, particularly non-homogenized. It seems to have an effect on how these little grains like to be fed. You can store these milk kefir grains for about 3 months in the freezer. You just have to make sure they're in a sealed bag. If it's longer than 3 months, you're really going to have to throw them out and start again, but hopefully you know somebody who has the grains. If it goes cheesy, like it smells cheesy and it kind of gets a bit cloggy, then you need to check for molds. Make sure that if it's a bright mold, if it smells really putrid, that you just throw it out. So that's pretty much all there is to it. You start with a sterilized glass jar. It's really important that it is initially sterilized. If you're using the same glass jar over and over again, you don't have to be as pedantic about that as time goes on. A double-layered muslin cloth with a tie. You can also use chucks, that works just as well. A strainer and clear bowl and a wooden spoon. People suggest non-metallic strainers. That might affect the SCOBY itself, particularly for water SCOBY. It doesn't love metal, so I'll leave that to you. 1 teaspoon of, or tablespoon I should say, of the SCOBY and about 1.5 cups of fresh whole milk. So we want all of the fat there, that's really important. And the product is going to be, once the SCOBY has started to do its fermentation, what you'll notice is the milk begins to separate into curds and whey, so you get that watery look on the top, and it will be effervescent, so you should see little bubbles. You want to pour the contents into the strainer, and that's your SCOBY. So you want to keep the grains separate, and then repeat. So put more milk in it and keep feeding it. You're going to go through a lot of milk, obviously, and you're going to have a lot of excess SCOBY after a while, so just give it away. If you can't give it away, just throw it into your garden if you have one. It can help with keeping away molds and yeasts, etc. from there. So you're going to drink the milk product at the end, and it's thin, it's watery, it's sour, and a lot of people will add flavour to it as a result. So think of berries and vanilla, coconut, mango, cinnamon, that sort of thing. Coconut and mango is actually quite delicious. I've used that one a couple of times. It hides the sourness, but if you love sour, then a lot of people will just drink it plain. You can also use that product to create second ferments, so things like cultured creams, cultured butters, buttermilks, etc. You know, when you need a product to start with, you need a fermentation to start with, this is what you use. Same with a water kefir. If you're not really into dairy, you can't tolerate dairy for whatever reason. It does feed on the lactase, so if lactase is the problem that you have, if you let the SCOBY continue to ferment until all the lactose is gone, you'd probably want to test it if you were intolerant or allergic, but that's an option if that's the problem. So the therapeutic effects of kefir, dairy kefir, are antimicrobial, generally better gut health, so it seems to help with balancing out the microbiome, anti-carcinogenic activities, which may have something to do with assisting in inflammation and the immune system of the gut, and assistance with lactose intolerance and enhanced immune function in general. Yogurt is using usually very specific bacterias in order to ferment milk. And you can get milk from lots of different animals, obviously, and they will all have very different flavors, but basically yogurt is usually in a very controlled temperature condition, and it just ferments for quite some time. What's important to know is that the bacteria that is used to ferment the milk doesn't survive the GIT tract, so they're considered transient rather than resident bacteria. So what you find is a lot of yogurt manufacturers these days are adding specific strains of bacteria that give a probiotic status, and we'll talk a little bit about probiotic status later. Just a note on the Thalia yogurt down there. This is actually one of the most well-researched bacterias, and yogurts can generally have a great range of nutrients like proteins and calcium. Can be good food as medicines if you're not intolerant. Cheese, you just ferment for much longer, so the bacteria are not only breaking down the sugars but also the fat and protein. And then once they've done that, you get specific odors, you're looking for specific odors, and then ripening you add different bacteria and molds to give flavor more than anything. So this is an example of the early stage production and then the later stage production of microorganisms with cheese. Fermented soy products are very popular throughout Asia. Traditional Asian diets consumed quite a bit of soy, but it was mostly fermented except for tofu, which is not fermented. Now, of course, in Western countries, we tend to consume soy a little bit differently in the form of things like soy milk. We also have fake cheeses and fake meat products that are made with soy, not fermented soy, just processed soy. And we also use processed soy for protein bars and protein powders, etc. And there is some concern about the use of high amounts of soy products, particularly that aren't fermented correctly. There's a lot of debate in the literature about whether that is contributing to estrogen-dependent cancers, for example, and whether soy should be consumed in that. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but it is an interesting debate that's happening. Fermented soy products, however, are a great source of isoflavones that are anti-cancer. Miso is one good example, a delicious example. It's made from soybeans, grains like rice or barley, and they will have very different flavors. Sea salt, pure water, and a particular type of mold. So you start with the mold, add it to the grain, and that produces koji, and the flavor of the koji will really significantly influence the type of miso that you get. In Asian cultures, generally they recommend darker and longer fermented miso in colder climates, lighter and less fermented miso in warmer climates, and red and moderate fermented miso in moderate to year-round climates. So it's just a little bit of food as medicine there. The color and flavor will depend on the koji, the amount of salt, and the length of fermentation time. And misos can be sold pasteurized or unpasteurized. Unpasteurized miso is the live food form. Prolonged cooking will kill the microorganisms. So if you're looking for that beneficial bacterial effect, unpasteurized miso is what you're looking for, and adding it just before you remove the food product that you're making with the miso from the heat. Miso is generally used in place of salt. It's quite a salty product, and that's giving you rough ratios there of how much salt is in how much miso. Next is tempeh. Not everybody's favorite food. Sometimes hard to disguise the flavor of tempeh, but it, in comparison to tofu, it's really high in nutrients in comparison. It's a fermented product as well. So tofu is, you can see there, you soak soybeans, cook and coagulate the soy protein, add calcium salts, and that brings it all together. And the protein that precipitates from that solution is collected, pressed, and it just kind of depends on how long that process goes for as to whether it's soft or firm tofu. Tempeh is you soak the soybeans, remove the seed coat, boil the cotyledons, which is the food for the little plant, cool them, and then you add a particular mold and incubate it. So it's fermented, it's a fermented product. In comparison to other soy products, it's a very good source of protein, fiber, lipids, iron, potassium, zinc, and some B vitamins. Also, I've written it is in there calcium and magnesium. This is a comparison of tofu to tempeh, which may entice you to eat tempeh more often. B12 was detected only in tempeh, so when we talked about B12 availability in like all fermented foods. This is one example of where it actually is available. So vegans and perhaps vegetarians who are having difficulties with B12, it may be a food to consider in your diet. This is a great example of food as medicine. So Tanzanian beverage called, I'm going to say it's Tagya, but I may be incorrect in that pronunciation. It's usually made from sorghum or maize and regularly consumed by young children, and the benefits of that is that there seems to be improved barrier function of intestinal mucosa for children aged 6 to 12 months with acute diarrhea, and in developing nations, diarrhea is sometimes tantamount to a death sentence. It's really important that there is a form of medicine that is cheap, readily available, that can be given in those instances. So that's a great example. Water kefir, we talked about dairy kefir. This is the water kefir version. I don't know if we have a picture of this. Oh, we do. So you can see it's more like, it's more gel-like. It's more see-through than the water kefir, milk kefir, sorry. Milk kefir is really cauliflowerish and it kind of grows up and on top of each other. This is like little tiny crystal looking things, generally see-through. And again, this is a SCOBY, so bacteria and yeast come together. Just different bacteria and yeast, which is why it works differently. It doesn't like milk, it likes water, but it likes a lot of sugar. So what you need for water kefir is your SCOBY, your filtered water, and it is important to have good quality water to begin with. Half a cup of sugar, so sucrose, for example, and then a flavoring. One of my favorites is actually just with berries. I do a mixture of berries and it comes up with like this effervescent, berry, delightful drink. Unlike milk kefir, which is quite sour, water kefir is very sweet. There's a lot of sugar in it. So you have to be really aware of how much sugar you're drinking, but it is delightful. It's like a berry champagne. So you're going to add all those ingredients together, seal the jar with make the jar airtight. With dairy kefir, it doesn't have to be airtight, and allow it to stand for 2 to 3 days. Stir it continuously, so you just kind of pick up the jar and mix it around. And of course, the little SCOBY, which you can see at the bottom of this jar, they just keep multiplying and multiplying, so you just kind of take some off and give them away. Share the love. So the first ferment is the product, and it's effervescent like ginger beer, so you can actually make a sort of form of ginger beer with ginger and other ingredients that you like the flavor of. I've done that as well. And it's generally enjoyed after 1 to 2 days refrigerated, and that's just a taste thing. If you don't like cold drinks, then you won't be refrigerating. It's not necessary. The product can also be used as a second ferment, so you can throw this into sauerkraut, which we explained before, and that just adds kind of an additional protection layer against bacteria and yeast, etc., that you may not actually want with you. Also remember, with these ferments, they are effervescent, so sometimes you need to burp the bottle, so just kind of unscrew the lid a little bit, let the gas go, put it back on again. You can get special lids that have a mechanism that enables that to continuously happen. If you get really into fermentation, then I'm sure you'll find it. Alcohols, of course, you're doing alcohol more in depth in session 25, so I'm really not going to go into it, but you have specific yeasts that ferment on sugars and produce carbon dioxide and alcohol. It's the carbon dioxide that makes it, that can make it blow up, and other products of fermentation that have either been left to go too long, or perhaps has been influenced by pathogenic bacteria, yeast, etc. And that'll make it blow up. So you just kind of have to be very careful. Wine and beer can be made, as I said, on pretty much any fruits or plant products that you can ferment, so you can throw some herbs in there as well. And breads. So with breads, this comes up in the wild fermentation, so you can make sourdoughs from wild ferment, or you can make sourdoughs from starter culture. And you can buy starter cultures. There are people who sell very fancy starter cultures with lots and lots of culture. So from specific parts of the world that are renowned for their breads, and famous bakeries will sell their starter cultures. It gets a bit fancy. Or you can just get some from the air, the environment around you. That can work just as well. So with bread making and bread development, basically raised breads were created in Egypt around 4000 BCE, and this bread that's used with a sourdough starter, so a wild fermenter, some form of culture, is known as sourdough. So that's the big difference. And sourdough is, I believe, a nicer tasting bread. That's why I make it. It won't carry any of the beneficial bacteria through to your microbiome, but it may have an effect on the digestibility of bread. And it's been suggested that when bread production became a lot more commercialized and much more shorter in production time, so not the time taken to really ferment the grains used, that may have had a detrimental effect on the gut and the absorbability of breads, particularly of product like gluten, which people seem to have increasing sensitivities to. It may be the way that breads were, that the production of breads has changed. That's just one theory. And finally, probiotics. So probiotics is a term used for foods or products that deliver live microorganisms with a suitable viable count of well-defined strains. And the reason that that's important is that a lot of the term probiotic is sometimes used in food marketing, which isn't as regulated as it could be. And when we're looking at probiotics from a therapeutic point of view, we're really needing to know as a clinician that what's in that food or what's in that product is going to give a therapeutic outcome that we've discovered through research, for example. So there's a lot more push towards standardization of probiotics, which is kind of in stark contrast to wild fermentation, which we talked a little bit about. So microorganisms are named genus, which is the first capitalized word there in Lactobacillus, the species, which is Acidophilus, and the specific strain, so LA5, for example. The research into the health effects of probiotics is rapidly expanding, and people are getting really more and more interested in the effects or the seeming interconnectedness between gut health and immunity. It's becoming more and more obvious. So probiotic research is really picking up as a result. And what we're finding is person to person, place to place, microbiome changes significantly, microbiota composition. So there are two ways to think about probiotics in health. One is targeted strain, which is used or discovered in research to alleviate or assist in a particular condition, and using that as an intervention strategy, versus something like a wild ferment, which takes into consideration the environment around the individual and perhaps what immune defenses are required as a result. And that may look at a bigger picture. So two very different ways of addressing probiotics, neither of which is more right than the other in my opinion. So probiotics are used for gastrointestinal as well as systemic conditions. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about that. And becoming familiar with products that contain specific strains and that hopefully are researched quite specifically can be of great use when you're in clinical practice and you're wanting to have you're wanting to assist the patient in having quite a specific effect. Remember that there's a large and broad spectrum in the microbiota. It's quite a clever and constantly changing system. So if you're giving large amounts of one specific strain of probiotics with nothing else, it may be that that strain overcrowds the other beneficial bacteria that are within the gut, and that may create imbalance in its own way. So it's just a few things to really think about. In saying that, there is so much great research out there for specific strains and conditions. So this is just a couple of examples: allergic rhinitis, ulcerative colitis. There's new information about mental health and the state of gut health. It's quite phenomenal, the broad range of health effects that these products have. So there you have it. That was a brief introduction into fermentation. Like I said, with these references, who have we got here? Holly Davis is an Australian chef, and she does some interesting trainings into cultures. We've also got Katz here, Salvador Katz, Wild Fermentation. He's written quite a few books though, so if you're very interested, look into that. And of course, Bill Mollison. That's a really useful. It's a really useful book. And somewhere here is a website. There's actually on the WHO website, there's a great section on ferments and the effects on traditional cultures, but it also gives you some recipe ideas as well. And so that's a really lovely free resource that if you're very interested, I'd recommend. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have some fun playing around with these kind of ideas. Start with something simple like sauerkraut and see how you go. And all the best with your healing journey and your patients. Thank you.